So, you want to do something different with your video footage, something dramatic and cinematic that'll make people stop and take notice, whether it's for YouTube or presentation for work or some other video project. But unfortunately, the only device you have that can shoot video is your smartphone. On top of that, because of social distancing, the weather, or for whatever other reason, you're stuck at home indoors. So with all of that working against you, how can you get the kind of quality video footage you want with so little to work with? Well, that's where we content creators have a chance to get creative with what we have available. And yes, with just a smartphone and a small light source, you can take pretty much any object and make it really come to life in your video footage. A number of fellow YouTubers have asked me to do tutorials regarding how I shoot and edit video footage for my channel. And because I'm working with several other YouTubers from around the world on a collab, some of the folks interested in the collab are curious about how to create footage that stands apart from the typical vlog-style angles, lighting, and composition that we see all over YouTube. And I get it, YouTube's super crowded with channels and content. So especially if you're a small YouTuber like me trying to grow your channel, you have to do something different from what everyone else is doing to get people's attention. But how do you shoot cinematic video if you're stuck indoors? For this tutorial, all of the examples I'm presenting were recorded in this one section of a room that's only a bit more than 6 feet or 2 meters square. And this is what it looks like. So this technique is not only simple, but doesn't require a lot of space at all. I chose this room to shoot footage for this video because the collab I mentioned earlier is going to be a music video, and so we're recording an original music track for this project. That means I gotta get this electronic drum set dusted off and finish setting it up so I can practice and not totally suck. But before I do that, even though the drum set's in pieces, not at all ready to be played, I figured I'd shoot footage while it's still a hot mess to make this tutorial a bit more challenging and interesting. So, to shoot the video footage we want, technically the only gear we need, as I mentioned in the intro, is a smartphone and a portable bright directional light source. You don't need professional lighting for this. Small table lamps with reflectors, and even something as simple as a flashlight like this one I've been holding, or as some of you call it, a torch, this will do just fine because it's got a bright, narrow beam. You can shoot all of your footage with both the phone and light handheld, as I did in this shot, which actually produces some of the best results because both the camera and light are moving. But in most cases, mounting your phone or light on a tripod, or whatever creative way you can think of, will make it easier to shoot your footage. And if you have a gimbal or a slider, that's even better. But again, the beauty of this approach is the minimal amount of gear needed to make this work. By the way, if you live in a country where English is spoken, what do they call these things where you live? Are they flashlights, torches, or something else? Languages fascinate me, so please let me know in the comments. Okay, so once you've got your gear in hand, it's time to put it to use. First, the framing and composition of your footage. That's going to make a big difference. Instead of trying to capture the entire scene in front of you, which again is what people often try to do when shooting videos, we're going to focus on a smaller part of the scene. And the idea is you want to take our composition and make it more interesting and really draw the viewer's attention into that scene. So back here in the music room, instead of shooting footage of this amplifier from normal eye level with a whole object in frame like you see here, I brought the camera and light in pretty close to the front of the amplifier and focused the camera on just part of the front grill and speaker cone. So by combining this with other tips in this tutorial, we were able to turn what otherwise would have been kind of an abstract product shot into a much more artistic composition. Second, let's talk about the choice of lighting we made earlier. Since we're only using this one light, there's no way we're going to achieve the polished, balanced, flattering look most people try to get for YouTube and when making videos in general. For this approach, we're actually trying to do the opposite by embracing the harsh, dramatic, high contrast, almost black and white look that shooting with one directional light creates. So for our next example, these small wing nuts and other bits of hardware aren't really much to look at until we use this simple lighting approach to totally transform how they appear in our footage. So third, have fun experimenting with different angles. You can try shooting from off to the side or from above, from below. You can actually tilt the angle, which is called a Dutch angle, or use combinations of these. I shot this footage you're seeing now while lying on the floor underneath the drum set, which also allowed me to capture a really cool shadow of the cymbal that the light projected onto the ceiling of the room. Fourth, as mentioned earlier, feel free to experiment with using the light and camera, handheld or stationary, but in all cases the key is to make sure there's motion in your shot. Now you don't need to go crazy trying to make your shot look something like racing drone footage, because remember, we want to keep the viewer's attention on the subject of your video, not on the camera movement itself. So with this technique, less is more. A little motion panning side to side or tilting up or down, moving in or out, that actually goes a long way. It takes some practice to get good results, and most of the time you'll need multiple takes to get a shot you like, but it's worth it. I shot all of the moving camera footage in this video handheld or with my tripod. No gimbal or slider. And even if you're having trouble getting steady looking footage when moving your phone, mounting your phone on a tripod, then slowly changing the position of the light, that can give you really amazing results as the shadows and highlights move within your shot. You can then simulate camera motion later when editing your footage by using variations of what's called the Ken Burns effect, in which you slowly pan or zoom using your editing software to make the final edit of the footage look even more dynamic. Now, let's make sure your phone's camera app is properly set up, because this is an absolute must for the footage to turn out the way you want. You can use whatever camera app you prefer as long as it allows you to do at least 3 things. You need to be able to record in slow motion, lock your focus, and manually set your camera's sensitivity to light, which for most camera apps will be the ISO setting. If you're confident in your photography skills and your app can also control shutter speed and white balance, that's even better. But for most people watching, if you can set the frame rate, focus, and ISO of your camera, you should be in good shape. The native camera apps on most Android phones allow you to control all of these settings. However, the native iPhone camera app currently does not let you manually set ISO. And I admit it, and I'm an Apple fanboy, but that's just silly. So if you use an iPhone, you'll need a third-party camera app, and if you haven't already installed one, well, there are several to choose from. The key is, again, you want to have manual control of ISO and the other settings. I use Filmic Pro, which works on both Apple and Android phones, and is still widely considered the gold standard for mobile phone videography. But many other popular apps, such as Movie Pro and Moments Pro Camera app, they provide features we need at a lower price than Filmic Pro. You may need to try a few apps to find one that works best for you, because these type of apps typically have a lot of features and menus, and their interfaces aren't standard, but it's worth the effort for the results you're going to get. Once you've gotten familiar with your camera app of choice, it's time to pick a slow motion frame rate to give your footage a smooth, gliding effect. I shoot almost all of the slow motion footage from my videos at 60 frames per second, but I doubled that to 120 frames per second for the footage in this video, since slow motion also has a way of making objects seem somewhat larger and more majestic than they are in real life. Since I set this video's frame rate at 24 per second and the slow motion footage was shot at 120 frames per second, what you see here is moving 5 times slower than normal speed. A slower frame rate also allows for more extreme changes in the playback speed of the footage, when a technique called speed ramping is used during editing. This can make the footage look even cooler, especially when the speed ramps sync up to music, as I'll demonstrate later. So feel free to experiment with different slow motion frame rates to see what works best for you, and it gets the results that you want in your final cut. Also, depending on what you're shooting, you'll want to consider locking the focus on a specific object within your scene. This isn't always necessary, and a lot of times autofocus works just fine. For example, if there's a clear shift from the foreground to the background, like in this shot I used to open my How I Got 10 Subscribers video. But it doesn't always work so well if the camera's not sure what to focus on in a given scene as the camera or light moves. Here, I lock the focus on the plug of this audio patch cord hanging in the foreground while the drum set in the background is a bit softly blurred. Next, watch as the light passes by, turning the plug into a silhouette, allowing it to remain the focus of our attention. This choice of focus, emphasizing the depth of field between the foreground and background, along with the use of light and motion to keep our attention on the plug in both brightness and shadow, that contributes to the cinematic look of this clip. Okay, now, this next step is going to be the one that really makes or breaks the quality of the footage we're trying to create with the cinematic video approach. And while you could choose not to use slow motion and just rely on your camera's autofocus and still get great shots, unless you dial in the proper ISO in your camera app, everything we've talked about so far is going to be a total waste of time, and you'll see why in a few minutes. What you need to do is set the ISO to the lowest value you can without the image becoming too dark. I recommend that you aim for an ISO of 50 or even lower if possible, depending on the brightness of your light and how far away it is from what you're shooting. This is another part of the cinematic video approach that may take some experimenting to get comfortable with, especially if you're new to manual camera settings. But it's one of the photography basics every content creator who wants high quality footage should know. The reason why is while a higher ISO results in the camera becoming more light sensitive, which is good in that it allows you to capture images even in very low light, the trade-off is the footage becomes more grainy the higher the ISO is set. And because of the amount of shadow produced using this technique, you'll get a lot of grain, especially in the dark areas of your footage shooting with a high ISO. And that can be really distracting and ruin your video, as you can see in this footage shot using the iPhone's native camera app, which again has no manual ISO control. Now, if we replay this native iPhone footage side by side with similar footage using Filmic Pro with the ISO set to 50, even despite all the compression YouTube adds to uploaded videos, which tends to unfortunately degrade the quality of our footage, the clip shot with Filmic Pro, especially in the dark areas, looks far cleaner. Another camera setting worth mentioning if your app has it is the manual control of image stabilization. Practice with and without the image stabilization turned on to see what looks best, especially when shooting handheld. Okay, once we've recorded the shots we want, it's time to edit the footage into a sequence that flows well from scene to scene. We want to sync up our clips as we talked about with a music track, and then we're going to turn up the volume and enjoy the final result. And by the way, if you want to promote your channel and join the collab, there's still time. Check out this video over here. I'll be posting a video with updates regarding the collab in a few days, so subscribe, turn on notifications to stay up to date so you don't miss anything that's happening and you don't miss the unveiling of the collab when it premieres. In the meantime, I'm going to finish setting up these drums and get in some practice, but feel free to hang out as long as you want, and I'll see you again soon.